Summa Theologica by Thomas Aquinas. First part, question 2 on the existence of God. Article 3, does God exist? Aquinas begins with 2 objections to the existence of God. One relies on the problem of evil, and when he responds to this objection at the end of the article, he will give an Augustinian response to the problem of evil, which is very brief, but is sufficient for his current purposes. And he will respond to the problem of evil itself more directly and in more detail later in the Summa. The second objection to the existence of God relies on the principle we now call Occam's razor. The principle that if you have a sufficient explanation for the things you observe, there is no need, and it is inappropriate to posit the existence of something else. A simpler explanation is better than a more complex one, as long as the simpler explanation suffices to explain what needs to be explained. And in this objection, Aquinas gives the argument that nature explains most of the phenomena we observe, and that the others are explained by the exercise of the human will. So natural and social phenomena are all explained by these 2 explanations, and there's no need to posit the existence of God. In his reply to this objection at the end of the article, Aquinas will explain that these may be good explanations for many phenomena, and he doesn't seem to object, at least in this location in the text, to the possibility that they explained all phenomena except for themselves. And they do not explain themselves because they themselves have a cause, because they look to a higher purpose. And they are directed to this higher purpose. Because nature and human will are directed to a higher purpose, it seems that they themselves need a cause, something that directed them to that higher purpose. Now let's get back into the 5 ways of proving the existence of God, the heart of the text, the heart of the article, and the reason almost anyone who is watching this video is watching it. After giving the objections, Aquinas gives his on the contrary. The on the contrary is a very brief statement. It is said in the person of God, I am who I am. And of course he is quoting from the Torah here, Exodus 3:14. Then when Aquinas answers the question, giving his own answer, he says the existence of God can be proved in 5 ways. Each of these 5 ways of proving the existence of God begins with some observations from everyday experience, things evident to the senses, things evident to us when we know the world in a perfectly ordinary fashion, in a perfectly ordinary way of knowing the world. We observe things about the world. And Aquinas says that these things need an explanation, and that explanation is God. The explanation for the things we observe is that the being we call God exists. Now, in reverse order, the 5th way is a teleological argument, arguing that God exists because things in nature are directed to an end. They are directed to a purpose. There is teleology in nature. And that direction to a purpose must have a higher intelligence which gave these things in nature that direction. The 4th way is sort of Platonic. Aquinas observes that in this world we have things that are more good than others. We have things that are less good than others. And we have things that are more noble than others and things less noble than others. And whenever you have this sort of gradations in the qualitative value of a thing, you must look for the cause of them. You must look for the explanation of them. The cause of the goodness in things is that which is maximally good. The ultimate goodness, the greatest goodness, is the explanation for all the goodness in things. The finite goodness we observe in things has behind it as its cause the greatest goodness. And the finite nobility we see in things has as its cause the ultimate, the greatest, the most perfect nobility. And this perfect goodness and perfect nobility is the being we call God. Now, the 3rd, 2nd, and 1st ways are all cosmological arguments for the existence of God. Cosmological arguments rely on cause and effect. They argue that God must exist as the cause of certain effects that we observe. Now, when you're dealing with cosmological arguments, you have 3 options. More generally, when you're dealing with causality, you have three options. When you're dealing with effects and causes, there are three ways you can explain them. One way is you can say that it's all started by something which is the cause of itself. Another way is you can say that there's an unlimited chain of causes. So, I exist because my parents caused me. They exist because their parents caused them. They existed because their parents caused them. And this just keeps going. There was no first cause. Everything in this chain of cause and effects has a cause. That would be the infinite regress option. So we have the cause of itself option, the infinite regress option, and then we have this third option, something exists which is an uncaused cause. Not a cause of itself, but the cause of everything else. The thing that explains everything else, which carries with it its own explanation. Not that it caused itself, but it is a sufficient explanation for itself. It's the unmoved mover, the cause of everything else, but not the cause of itself. The uncaused cause of everything except itself. That's the theistic way, and that is, of course, what Aquinas will do. Now, the notion of a thing that is a cause of itself just doesn't work. In order to cause itself, a thing would have to exist and not exist at the same time. It would have to not exist in order to be able to be caused, because only something that is not can be caused to be. But only something that is can cause. So something cannot cause itself. It's a logical contradiction. As for an infinite regress, many people, and I have been among them many a time in the past, have looked at the 5 ways of Aquinas and presumed that what he was relying on here was this old idea stretching back to Aristotle that an actual infinite set of things doesn't make sense, that there's some logical contradiction involved in the idea of an infinite set of distinct objects. Now, we're not saying no such thing as infinity might exist. For example, God might be considered an infinite goodness, and of course many medieval philosophers certainly thought that way. But that's not the same thing as an infinite number of distinct objects. God is one object, one thing, one being, one substance. And one substance with infinite goodness or something like that, yeah, that makes sense to the Aristotelian mind. But an infinite number of different things does not make sense. And so many people presume that when Aquinas rules out the possibility of an infinite regress of causes, that all he's doing is presuming that an infinite number of separate things presents a contradiction. If you want to understand that contradiction, I would suggest studying the illustration called Hibbert's Hotel, which I'm sure you will find on Google. Hibberts, Hibbert's Hotel. But this is not at all what Aquinas is doing. He is not relying on the alleged logical contradiction of the idea of an actual infinite set of things. He is relying on a principle that philosophers sometimes call the principle of sufficient reason. When something needs to be explained, there must be a sufficient explanation available for it. Now let's go back to me and my causes. I exist because I'm caused by my parents. There was a possibility of me not existing, so we need an explanation for my existence. The explanation is my parents. But while I get that explanation from them, that explanation doesn't originate with them, because they also need an explanation, because they could have not existed. So they are explained by their parents. And while they got their own explanation from their parents, my grandparents, do not originate that explanation. That explanation comes through them, but it doesn't come from them, because they also could have not existed. And when you have a chain of causes and effects this way, every effect is explained by its cause, but only if that cause itself is explained. And so if there's no beginning of an explanation, there's no explanation anywhere in the whole chain. That is what Aquinas is thinking. And that is why he rules out the possibility of an infinite regress. If there is no first cause, then there is no explanation for anything that is caused in the whole chain, and therefore God must exist. That is Aquinas' cosmological argument. That's the general structure of the three cosmological arguments, which are 1, 2, and 3 of the 5 ways.